Hello. Hi. It's so good to see all of you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Kay. I help you organize e-flux's books. And happy solstice. Thank you for being here on the longest day of the year. But tonight is the second to last lecture of the season, I think, so I just wanted to give a quick and heartfelt congrats to Amal Issa for organizing the e-flux lectures, and grateful recognition to Giovanna Venegas, who's in the back, for making them all possible too. The same to Stephen Squibb, Brian Kwan-Wood, who edit e-flux Journal, along with Anton Vidokle and Julieta Aranda, and who have hosted a full and great season of lectures. Congrats and thanks also to Rivers Plaskidis and Aaron Farrow-Murray and all of our sound and documentation people. Thank you. Okay, and thank you most of all to Ariel Goldberg for being here tonight. Ariel is the author of The Photographer from Roof Books, as well as Picture Camera, The Photographer Without a Camera, and most recently, The Estrangement Principle, which is out in 2016 from Nightboat Books, and there is one copy left in the back, so afterwards, whoever gets there first can purchase a copy. We were lucky enough to include a chapter from Ariel's precise, generative, and engulfing artwork of a book-length essay in e-flux Journal this past spring. Through their written and visual work, as well as by hosting and expanding a community of artists as the Friday Night Series reading coordinator at the Poetry Project for the past years, Ariel has brought into needed focus a complicating depth to fields and terminologies sometimes taken for granted elsewhere or in general. They have taken into careful, generous examination immense entities, including photography, queer art, and a major subject of tonight's talk and this year at large, the news. Please welcome Ariel Goldberg to e-flux. Thank you.
Wow, Kay, thank you so much, and Amal for inviting me, and hello everyone in the audience. Thanks for being here. I feel really nervous, but I set my timer, so hence the nervousness. I'm off to a good start. So I've been working a lot the past few days on really new material, and after like 2 years of editing and then doing like publicity for a book, so it feels really invigorating and experimental, whatever that means. So here we go. You can zoom. You couldn't always zoom. Unless you had a magnified glass and the actual photograph. Unless you had the negative in the enlarger. An early or recent version of the photo application known as used to lock the photo into one size, and sometimes I would try to zoom. Because the photos on the phone in this other application allow you to touch the screen by spreading your thumb and pointer finger outwards, and then you could get closer to the details. The headline, a blown-up balloon deflating till it shrivels with stretch marks of its expanded life. Headlines each day, that regularity. Now the picture is fuzzy, out of focus, until the connection allows it to load into its sharpness. Now it's easier to read if someone shows a picture of the news. Levitating newspaper here, blurry from the low light. The ground and the sky sort of hold the paper together. The negative space engulfs as a piece of the city's library, abandoned, the city around it sort of erased. The darkness, its spotlight. This is a photograph by Diane Arbus. This is a photograph by Facundo de Zuviera, and it's from 2001. It's part of a series called Siesta Argentina in Buenos Aires. And the photographer says about the series, These images reflect small urban stores that have been locked up in broad daylight, all photographed from a precise frontal viewpoint, a metaphor of the big crisis Argentina suffered in 2001 to 2002, financial crisis. Here you can see the newspaper as a sort of functional object. It's a disposable shade to protect a closed business, a business in transition. Perhaps renovations are going on inside the businesses where these sort of photographs are demonstrating the newspaper as a screen. This is a photograph by Nacho Lopez, and it's part of a photo essay that he published in 1950 called The Street Reads. And it takes place in Mexico City, and was published originally in Mañana, which was sort of a Life magazine type publication. I could stare at this photograph for a really long time. You can see it, it's there. And what I really love about it is the huge window, and that acts sort of like a mirror, and all the different shapes of like the light fixture versus the figures sort of play with scale. And right in the middle of the image, it's sort of hard to see because it's through a reflection, is somebody reading the newspaper. And there's in the bottom right-hand corner, a really interesting sandwich board of what looks to be periodicals for sale on the street. And I'm interested in this picture having a prominent window in it because Nacho Lopez's father, I read, was a window display designer and worked for palm olive, in the 30s and 40s in Mexico. So this photograph prompts me with the question, how do people appear with the newspaper in public, which is sort of what this lecture is about, this talk. And what do newspapers symbolize when they're being used in public? So this may look familiar to you because it was the publicity image for this event. So I've had the pleasure of noticing something new about this photograph every time I look at it. It's a Helen Levitt photo from around 1971. All of her 100+ photos that are color slideshow images that is in a book also and in the permanent collection at MoMA, and it's often on display in their permanent collection in the photography area. They're all titled New York. There's no more specification than that, just New York. And a fun fact, but it's not fun at all, it's actually really sad, is that Helen Levitt, 10 years before she took this photograph using color film, because she did a lot of black and white work in the earlier decades, all of that work was stolen. She had a huge, 2 years worth of street photography on color slide film from 1959 and 1960, and it was all stolen by a supposed cat burglar, according to John Shurkowski, however you say his name. Yeah, I don't know if the street lines in the city are still orange, the crosswalks, but I like looking at those lines, and also you can kind of see the words vote and system, or I like to read those in the headline of this newspaper, which I think resonates as a contemporary headline when looking at this. And then another interesting thing I noticed yesterday when looking at this photograph is that this figure in the foreground is actually passing someone in the crosswalk. I don't have a laser beam, but I don't know if anyone can see that there's a head of hair on top of the very frontal figure's head of hair, and then also a sort of line of somebody else's clothing is right behind her, a sort of floral print. I don't know if anyone can see that in the back. Anyone? Yeah? Okay. So this is also, so Helen Levitt had just, SCAS has, I think, I calculated it roughly, 10% of this entire body of work has people reading the newspaper on the street. This is another photo. Someone reading the news on the street. This is another Nacho Lopez photo, and it was the first image in the photo essay, La Calle Le, from 1950. So now I'm going to transition to sort of thinking about people interacting with the newspaper on the street as and not really reading it. Everybody that we just looked at was really engrossed in the newspaper, and I have surmised in this Helen Levitt photograph that the reader is treating the newspaper as a companion, as a time passer, and almost as a prop to appear occupied. And of course, the split-second photograph allows me to infer or imagine or fantasize about his glance elsewhere. He doesn't look like he's reading the news, but sort of trying to look cool reading the news, perhaps. This is a photograph by Charles Teeney Harris from 1961, and it's titled Man Holding Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And the photo that Harris took probably appeared in a different newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier, which was one of the oldest and widest circulating black newspapers in the United States in the 20th century, where Harris worked for over 40 years in Pittsburgh. And the featured headline, the metadata on this photo through the Carnegie Museum told me this, reads, U.S. gives Shepard full honor. And I looked up who Shepard was, and he was an astronaut, part of the Mercury missions, of which the mathematician Katherine Johnson had a pivotal role in, dramatized recently in the film Hidden Figures. So we don't know, or I don't know, what the subject's connection is to this daily paper, but he's really posing with it. This is another Charles Teeney Harris photo, and it's titled Children Visit a Printing Shop. And the Carnegie Museum also adds this question mark that perhaps it is the press, the Pittsburgh Courier, that Harris worked for, being depicted, and the photo is dated 1945 to 1949. So thinking about the production of newspaper, the people that work around the production of news, this is a portrait by Leon Ruiz, and it's part of a series called Retratos de Cuerpo Entero, or Portraits of the Whole Body, and it was shot in Guayaquil, Ecuador in 1980, where Ruiz traveled from Colombia and set up a portrait studio that was open to the street, attached to a corner store, and he did portraits of people who were active in the street life there, and this is of a newspaper seller, the beautiful bicycle and carrier for his papers that he can also show off. And I love that this photo was taken only with natural light that came in, and it was shot with a Hasselblad, which would be nice to own. And another interesting fact about Ruiz as a photographer was that he sold cameras for 8 years before he started photographing. Helen Levitt, again, there's a few of her here. And again, I'm interested in this photo because it shows a boarded up newsstand and this sort of interesting stack of papers to the right of the person waiting or just looking good on the street. And we don't know in this photo if the news stack is being dropped off or picked up. I used to try to convince delis to give me their newspapers they didn't sell when I was younger, and then I learned then when they said no that news companies come and pick up newspapers that aren't sold. This is a photo by Jessie Tarbo Beals, who is known to be the first woman photojournalist. I put that in quotes because I think it's skeptical to do the first thing. And it's from 1902. And it shows kids on a break from selling newspapers in Buffalo, New York. And I've thought about this picture as a sort of performance. where it doesn't seem like the subjects are recognizing the photographer, but because it's 1902 and because it was a woman photographer, it's highly likely that they were trying not to look at her and very aware of her presence because of her cumbersome equipment. And newsboys, sort of on a break, having fun, making fun of their teacher, who knows. Another photograph of a newsboy taking a break, and this is also Nacho Lopez, and he followed his friend, the sculptor Pedro Cervantes, early on in his career in 1962, when he took a bunch of his sculptures out onto the street and then documented how people interacted with them. And this sort of looks like a sculpture of a bird made of car junk parts welded together. And I really love how the person, I guess, to the right of the newsboy is holding one of the newspapers. The newsboy has a whole stack in his arm. And they just had this sort of business exchange, and then they're looking at art together, which is a different relationship. And this is a photograph by Hector Garcia, who actually worked as a newsboy as a child and then went on to be a photographer. And he writes in this amazing journal that is published through the Centro de la Imagen in Mexico City, Lunacornia, about his childhood in the third person. So this is Hector Garcia talking about being a newsboy. At the age of 7, the young Marco Polo from Luis Moya Street took a suspicious detour on his way to school and made several trips to Bucareli, the distant world of newspaper boys where he first experienced in the flesh the great globe-trotting novels he had read. I like this photo because I really don't think that the child in the photo is a newsboy. I think with her piggy bank, she's looking to make a purchase here. But the newspaper is almost as big as her or the doll, and it sort of interrupts their communication, or it looks almost as though she's trying to tell the doll what the newspaper is saying. So this is a sort of historical preamble to the second part of what I'm going to talk about, and I'm just going to end on a Bernice Abbott photograph from 1935 of a newsstand in Midtown Manhattan, which I like looking at this picture because I think the subject or the reader of the newspapers looks comically tiny, and that the sort of the mass of periodicals that surround him become this really huge wallpaper of the city, to the point where the cash register is just this sort of antidote tucked into it. And of course, newsstands mostly sell not newspapers. There's a lot of white women trying to look beautiful on the cover of magazines, and a lot of candy and sugar. But there is a magazine tucked away underneath something in the bottom right corner that says Photoplay. Wonder what that is. And this is the unsung and erased from history caption written by Bernice Abbott's lover, Elizabeth McClausen, the art critic, who annotated her project, Changing New York, of which this photo was a part, where she lists kind of in detail how many newspapers in the 30s were produced in New York City. Crazy statistics like New York City alone has 146 newspapers, daily printing at 3 million copies. Altogether, there are 1,275 periodicals published here and 787 newspapers of all kinds. And then it goes on, and that got edited in the book published for the World Fair. So that's my little photo history moment. And I'm switching gears now there's about 4 parts to this talk. And what I'd like to do now is think about this one moment in the film Born in Flames by Lizzie Borden from 1983. And there's a lot of plot that happens in the film. I'm just curious how many people have seen the film Born in Flames, 1983. Okay, I'll do some of the plot. So I really recommend watching it, and I'm not going to cover the whole film. But there's a lot of feminists from different race, class, sexual sort of groups that are not really working together well. And there's one group called the Women's Army, and the leader of that group is Adelaide Norris. And There's another group that doesn't really gel with Adelaide Norris, and those are the sort of white middle-class journalists of the Socialist Youth Review, which is a newspaper that is, you can see the newspaper that's on the clothespin at this newsstand, this makeshift, low-budget film newsstand. That's the Socialist Youth Review. Tragically, Adelaide Norris is murdered in the film, spoiler alert, and she was really doing a good job in organizing, so the FBI decided to do something about that. And there's another figure in the film, in addition, I really like to think of Born in Flames as an examination of lots of different types of media, not only newspapers, but also flyers, radio shows. There's 2 warring radio stations. Honey, it represents sort of black feminist radio station, Radio Phoenix, and then there's Isabel of Radio Ragazzo, and she's white, and they don't really get along either. And then this moment in the film, which I'm going to show you a few stills, is when Honey is walking down the street and sees and learns for the first time on the street at the newsstand about the death of Adelaide Norris at the hands of a suspicious death. Of course, that the jail is saying she committed suicide in jail, which is hauntingly familiar to how Sandra Bland's death was talked about in the media. So this is Honey seeing the headline and the photo. Suicide ? Was their headline. Honey taking in the news, buying the newspaper, and then bringing it back to her radio station and letting her comrades know about it, and immediately they decide to go on the air and announce to their listeners that they're going to do something about it, and this is the moment for everyone to come together. And Lizzie Borden's film is often thought to be a sort of sci-fi film, and people have, critics have said that the fantasy is that there is a coalition that forms after this moment, after this tragedy. And that's the portrait of Adelaide Norris. And in the story, the journalists who published this actually got fired for writing that they didn't think it was a suicide. That was too radical for their socialist newspaper. All right, so a lot about the spirit of Honey's radio show, Radio Phoenix, of Born in Flames, fantasizing about radical forms of news distribution, I think manifest in Democracy Now!, which I will now spend some time talking about. And one interesting crossover between Democracy Now! Recently and Born in Flames was that, yeah, you can bump it up, it's okay. This is the theme song of Born in Flames, Lizzie Borden's film. It's a song by the Red Crayola from 1981. And as I'll talk about later, Democracy Now! Is these kind of amazing musical breaks to the content that pops up on the show. And they have these montages, so this is sort of what Democracy Now! Looks like, if you're not familiar. Really intense. So this is a song that plays throughout Born in Flames, and also Amy, I think, Amy Goodman was signaling to Lizzie Borden and sort of making an alliance with her. And this was from March of this year. Okay. Different multimedias here. So this is Amy Goodman in 1996. And I so far have talked about the production of the news as being slowed down in photos, frozen in those photographs, and then also in the film, Born in Flames, how there's different constructions of the news that are counter-narratives, black feminist radio stations, in Born in Flames, there's an interruption of a broadcast by the president, which is really cool. That features Florence Kennedy, a civil rights lawyer, as playing herself, really. And I think I have to pause here and ask very honestly, what is the news, or how am I defining the news? Because it's like a huge thing. As Kay mentioned, I'm attracted to the impossible largeness of things. And I have been focusing a lot on structure, or a zoomed out kind of like you can't really read the headline and not the content. And I'm interested if this extrication of content is even possible. And I think it's not, but I'm going to continue entertaining the thought of let's look at structure. So if I had to define the news, because Carolyn, my girlfriend, read a draft of this and said, you have to define the news, so I'm doing it right now. It's about subjectivity and who's reporting and what they're choosing to report and who is receiving the news. And an honest definition of the news is also for me to just talk about what I watch. I think one of the main questions I asked people, this year, friends, was what news are you consuming, or where do you get your news? I'm interested in that threshold of taking in the news. And Democracy Now! Is my primary source of news, and I've come to become a little bit obsessed with the idiosyncratic personality of the executive producer of Democracy Now!, which is Amy Goodman, who I will often refer to as Amy, as if I'm on a personal level with her. Yeah, and this is from one of her first broadcasts. This appears to be a mural that somebody made for her that has a projection of a New York Times headline. And then there's also like an extension cord sort of taped to the tarp at the bottom, and she's in the middle of doing her thing. And I started to think about what are Amy Goodman's tactics, and also this question of how does somebody perform as a newscaster amidst all the seeming flux, e-flux, all the flux, and that we are supposed, like people are like, everything is in chaos, and it's really like not, like of course all of the struggles and battles are ongoing ones, and I think Democracy Now!'s archive makes that clear. Yeah, so I started to think about how does Amy Goodman represent consistency, what is repetitious, what is endurance-based about this news broadcast, which is in its 20th year right now. And different than the photos that I showed earlier and the clip from this film, which is fictional, is that when I'm consuming Democracy Now!, I'm doing it in a sort of intimate way where it's on a small screen inside my apartment or it's inside my headphones. Like I'm not like performing the reading of the newspaper. So something interesting about Democracy Now! Is that they have not changed their theme song for the full 20 years. And it's very hard to sing along to. I've tried. It sort of begins as a strumming of an acoustic guitar that leads to an amped up string instrument, and then a chorus of saxophones fly in. It's as if a marching band just arrived to the protest and provided the crowd with new energy. And I think there's even a flute that whistles in the medley. And Amy talks over this theme song, and the technicians cue clips of voices of the people who are directly affected by the torrent of injustices also at the very top of the show. So I've noticed also in going into the archives how Amy's voice was much higher and tighter and firmer in the early years and in the late 90s, and I almost didn't recognize her as Amy Goodman when I started listening to the first episodes. And I think it's because I'm really maybe worried, but I feel like Amy Goodman's voice is always cracking. Like she seems really stretched thin, strained, and I've even imagined sending her a Camelback water hydration backpack to save the time it would take to lift a glass of water, because she's also really always in a rush, right? It's always urgent. It's always like a really tragic headline that she's reading. And she also has this very intense cough, which the microphone picks up. And she, despite all of this, still represents endurance, I think. So her co-hosts, Juan Gonzalez, who is a visionary and a really amazing journalist, and was the Minister of Education for the Young Lords. And when he was younger, he worked for 29 years at the Daily News. He just retired in May, although he did write a column about Oscar Lopez Rivera. And he's also the founder and president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, so a very, very active activist journalist. And Nermeen Sheikh is also a producer and host of Democracy Now! But Juan and Nermeen appear much more rested and healthy compared to Amy on the show for whatever reason. And also, Juan and Nermeen don't read the headlines unless Amy is absent from the show, which she rarely is. And it's really noticeable, it's really interesting when Amy's not there, because she just has such a stamp on the production of this news show. So over the years, Amy's interview style, I've noticed, has also become really abbreviated, especially in contrast to Juan and Nermeen's more nuanced and attentive questions. In the interview segments of the show where they have guests, activists, lawyers, doctors, professors, Amy says things like, "You were a part of the protest, explain." These are my Amy Goodman impressions. I'll go back to her. "Talk about blank." Or she'll play a clip of like a Republican senator saying something insane, and she'll be like, "Your response?" So it's not funny, but it is, weirdly. And I don't know what to do with that, noticing that. And also, Democracy Now! Really is very serious in terms of following protocols of journalism, despite that they're a small 24-person nonprofit, media nonprofit. They take themselves very seriously. So for example, when they had Lennox Hines, the lawyer and law professor who represented Assata Shakur on the show, on a show with Angela Davis as well, to talk about in 2013 how Assata Shakur was placed on the terrorist watch list, that Amy Goodman prefaced this whole segment by saying, "In all seriousness, we invited the FBI to be on the show, but they did not respond." And I really had this moment where I felt like I respected their attempts at objectivity. And it was sort of like as if the FBI would join the show. And I know that's like a journalistic standard thing where you just have to say that you tried to get a balanced opinion. So Amy Goodman's like obsessed with getting on the New York Times bestseller list because she wants to expand the viewership of her show. But she has been had this article written about her that was sort of about how Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! Were the first people to occupy Wall Street. And the New York Times wrote a story about that. And they refer here in the headline to how it's a grassroots, independent, low budget, sort of stretch-thin organization, which makes it feel analog, because it's also notably outside of the 24-hour news cycle. And part of their low budgetness, I think, is that I have an app for the show, and it doesn't really work very well. And I even have to go to the browser to play the show, which is the point. It's supposed to be the opposite, getting the app. And they have a really great sort of graphics on the show where they show, this is Dr. Reverend William Barber, who's the president of North Carolina NAACP and runs the Moral Mondays there. And they show like a slideshow and then on a diagonal to the guest, who, if they're live streaming in. All gender toilets, gender neutral toilets. I'm gonna speed up here and say, another thing that I've noticed about Democracy Now! Also is, and something I think about a lot in general, is like thank you gifts and supporting small nonprofit work, and then how that becomes a part of the fabric of the city. These are some examples of thank you gifts. They have DVDs and CDs available. Again, that analog aspect, given that they also have everything live streaming. Mugs and coffee. You can get coffee beans that say Democracy Now! On the bag. And I had this interesting moment where I thought I realized something, where I saw somebody wearing a Democracy Now! Hat on the street, and I was like, nice hat. And then he said, thanks, nice bag. And I looked down and I realized I was wearing a Sylvia Rivera Law Project tote bag that says liberation is a collective process. And it was a little bit off. Like I was like, oh, this isn't enough. So I think that one thing that I think about with Democracy Now! A lot, like my main critique of it, is that it really overuses what I think are shocking videos of militarized state or private security companies exerting violence. And Democracy Now! Is part of this school of journalism that believes in disseminating upsetting images. And I think it's important to think about with disturbing images like this, like who is the audience, who needs to see this, and who doesn't. And I imagine that this imagery is not only difficult but traumatic to watch, especially for those who are directly impacted by anti-Black and anti-brown racism and violence in this country every day. And I think that this is something that really I disagree with their tactics on Democracy Now! It's a lot about shocking images replayed. And I've found that the more respectful, contemplative, mournful moments of the show happen when there is a pause and there is no reporting happening, and those happen on the musical breaks when they're not rushing to expand public awareness to enact social change. So I had, the title of this email says, Your Democracy Now! Art Project, and it was sent to one of my dear friends, Sunita Prasad, who wrote me back about it because I just remembered she made art about watching Democracy Now! And in short, she was like, I was like, can I watch some footage of your project? And she was like, no, it's in storage. And she filmed herself watching Democracy Now! And crying. And she then did a public performance where she, and these are her words, I served the audience tea and we listened together to a Democracy Now! Segment in which a Palestinian doctor who works in an Israeli hospital describes the IDF bombing his house and killing his children. I cried on stage, we cried together as a group. So I think, I'm not thinking about these things alone, about consuming the news. Sometimes I'm listening to Democracy Now! And I'm going through my daily routine in the morning and it feels wrong, like it feels like I should either stop listening and focus on it and not try to multitask, so to speak, or I should, stop listening and continue with my routine. Like I should choose. I can't really do both. So there's a lot of really, like I've mentioned, difficult material on Democracy Now! And I've thought a lot about how there is a script to the show and a formula in trying to awaken people to all the fucked up systems of power. And I remember that moment that I started watching Democracy Now! And it felt like, my whole world changed. And I was thinking about how Amy Goodman has appeared on other shows. Particularly, she went on the Colbert Report. And it's this interesting moment of comparing Democracy Now!, which is so serious and lacks irony, to the sort of genre of late-night TV shows that use humor to grapple with the devastating systems of power. And on the show, Colbert interrupts her when she's giving a monologue about the Iraq War and how the troops need to come home, and the soldiers think so too, and says, "That's a nice monologue, Amy," which I think really pointed to how she delivers her news, and talked about the structure, actually. And I learned, after feeling very defensive for Amy Goodman on Colbert, that he does this with everyone, like he's like an asshole. That's his thing. But I didn't know that. And yeah, I think Amy Goodman has a lot of sort of bizarre moments where she's so literal. Like, for example, when she poses for pictures, she puts up a peace sign. And it's like, on the one hand, culturally appropriative. On the other, I think she actually just wants to say, like, I want world peace. Yeah, and I'm realizing, as I suspected, that I'm running out of time. So I'm going to do that thing where I breeze. But basically, I started to think about the role of art on Democracy Now!, actually, and like there is all this devastation and there is all of this horror and tragedies, but Amy Goodman has part of their formula on Democracy Now! Is to make art like the hopeful thing. and to make art the thing where it's like you can use your voice to speak truth to power. And thinking about, I really respect Democracy Now! For something that's really crucial right now, which is that they've always considered artists to be authorities in telling the news. And you know, it's not like art is a section in the newspaper. They want to hear from artists about the political art that they're doing. And they often cover like censorship or really like dramatic body art or art that deals directly and explicitly with war. This is Donald Lipsky, who's, you know, I don't know, rubber band ball of American flags, was destroyed at a Long Island University campus. This was in the first year of her show. She had him on in one of the very first episodes. So like, art has always been a priority as something to cover in this show. This was how it got destroyed. Amy Goodman does like 2 big trips to art events each year. She goes to the Sundance Film Festival. This is her talking to Jay-Z about his Khalif Browder project, and she also goes to the Venice Biennale. I don't know if she's been yet this year actually, but a lot, when I was searching for artists on her show, a lot from the archive was from there, from the Venice Biennale. This is an artist who was on the show this year, Rigo23. I love that they called him in the bottom, if you can't see, of this screen, a political artist. And he made a sculpture of Leonard Peltier at American University in December, and the FBI like complained about it because it was right when, as for many decades, people have been trying to get Leonard Peltier clemency and to be released from prison and petitioning Obama to do so, which he did not. And it got removed because the FBI wrote a letter saying that it was like offensive. And earlier when this sculpture was in progress, Rigo23 would bring it all over the country and took Leonard Peltier's feet and had people stand on them. And they really go in depth about the project. It's really a beautiful story on him, on his work. And Wafaa Balil has been on the show. I'm going to breeze through. This is Hubert Waldrop, who made a mural for Amadou Diallo that included characterizing the police that killed him as the Ku Klux Klan, and that got painted over by somebody the day the mural was unveiled. This is in Manhattan. All right, so Democracy Now! Is the news, and I have thought a lot about how I could ask the question of these sort of 20th century photographs of the news now, like what does the news look like when photographed in the contemporary? So these are some photos that I've gleaned from my Instagram, and a lot has to do with how like news now, of course, is not just through news sources. Individuals are producing their own news. Protests are often covered and problematically, right? Because you don't want to like show the face of protesters if that may endanger them to the authorities. But pictures of protests often appear. This was a protest for a Celebrate Israel parade that Jewish Voice for Peace intervened at, and actually 7 protesters were arrested, making these signs, Queer Jews for a Free Palestine, No Pride in Apartheid. And in the comment section of this, this is on Morgan Basicki's Instagram, is this comment that said, "Saw you on Democracy Now! You're beautiful." So there's some crossover there. I think my definition of a photograph of the news now really is summarized in this image that was captured by the Her Story Instagram, which covers, it's sort of like images of lesbians through time. Although I think it's kind of like 80s and 90s to now. So this was a protest in Berkeley against the Milo guy, and there are these signs in the back here that say, I don't know if you can read them, that say trans dykes are good and pure. And this was actually, the New York Times published this photo, but it was in that slideshow of the evening briefing, which I think is, I couldn't find this image on the Times, like in there when I searched for it, and I didn't know how to find it, so I was really glad that someone took a screenshot of it. So screenshots are really important in photographing the news right now. It's my theory, whatever. I saw a photograph of the news in an art show at this gallery in Chelsea. This is A.L. Steiner's art, And it's a printout, and this is the best I could do in terms of clarity, but I can tell you that that headline says something about churches and LGBT rights. And you can sort of recognize, if you read the New York Times, the formatting through the blurriness, but it's in the corner of the room that there's like photographs of people and places, sunset, and there's some installation there, and then the photograph of the newspaper is just in the corner. And this is that fateful day on November 8th when it appears as though A.L. Steiner went to Democracy Now! With a bunch of other wild merch, anticipating a toppling of the patriarchy. But a more literal photographing of the news I've seen happen with these sort of when people take a picture of the physical newspaper, and of course here, Jewish Voice for Peace again is challenging the way the New York Times is reporting on Palestinian liberation, on Israeli apartheid, and in their caption, they're sort of rivaling what the newspaper has to say. But you can see the sort of human touch to the newspaper. It crinkles, it has a dimensionality. This is, Gordon sent me this picture, Gordon Hall, and I think it's of Amy Silman's Instagram, where she photographed a newspaper of this creepy handshake. I saw this on Instagram also, Andrew Durbin saying fuck you to a big screen at what appears to be a Planet Fitness because of the purple elliptical training machines. And this is a documentation of a really amazing project that I've just become acquainted with by Alexandra Bell, where she's making these murals that redact and rewrite and change the racial bias of the New York Times, and shows the original and then recreates it. And these are huge murals, and I've also received a postcard of it, so it's roaming right now as public art in New York City, and I think is very effective in intervening with how the news is told. Democracy Now! Appeared briefly in Sandra Perry's exhibition Resident Evil at the Kitchen this fall. It was on the screen facing the couch. It was an interview between Amy Goodman and Ramsey Orta, who documented the final moments of Eric Garner's life. So there's lots of newspaper art. I'm going to just skip those two to say that every day I find out about a new artist who's making work using the news. And it made me think also, like, well, what isn't a photograph of the news, really? And, like, here's a memorial by journalists in Mexico City for Javier Valdez Cardenas, who was a journalist who was murdered in Sinaloa in May. So I wanted to include that as a sort of homage to him also, and to think about, like, you know, it's dangerous to tell the news. So in the final minutes of my talk, I'm going to introduce photographs of mine that I've taken of the news, of newspapers specifically. And the reason that I wanted to explore this topic and my fascination with the news is that I noticed that not only was I attracted to photographs of newspapers in photography history and also the now, but I'm also extremely like, I'm always repeating myself in that I'm like taking the same picture over and over again. So I'm like a collector in that sense, where I'm still trying to figure something out, and then I have repetition streaming through these images. And so, yeah, I took this picture in Manhattan, and it sort of is like the Facundo de Viviera picture, where the newspaper is on the front of a closed business and is trying to protect people from seeing inside of it. When I was preparing this, I was trying to have like newspaper memories, so I wrote some of them down. I once got yelled at by a news seller to stop looking at the papers and that I should just buy one, and or like go look over someone's shoulder, like don't sort of linger at my stand without purchasing something. And I really listened to him, and I've since then had a newspaper subscription, a print subscription to the New York Times, basically for the past 10 years, on and off. But there was a moment where I lived in California, and I sort of cringed at the design of the San Francisco Chronicle, like I couldn't handle it, and that's when I sort of knew that I was like, obsessed with the New York Times, and that it represents the newspaper to me, even though I constantly disagree with it, and I don't, like the content is not, I trust Democracy Now! More, I should say. Like there's an exhibition up right now, I don't know if anyone's seen it, at Flag Art Foundation that said that's all about art only made with the New York Times, and I don't know why they didn't open it up to also include art that's made about Democracy Now! Anyway, I wasn't the curator. And another thing that I've had to confront in my newspaper fascination is that it represents home. Like both my parents read the New York Times every day. I remember my father when he'd come home from work, so he was an accountant in Manhattan, and I grew up in New Jersey. He would wash his hands, and I would watch the soap kind of turn gray and drip into the sink. Like it really physically became a part of him. And I also have memories of us looking at headlines together that were really big, as opposed to like the New York Post or the Daily News, where the headlines are always big because it's more of a tabloid paper. I saw this delivery of the Daily News just the other day, which was pretty exciting. And the other realization I had about my obsession with the news that wasn't immediate somehow was that I did this series of photographs. This is another picture of mine of the news, washed up on the beach. Yeah, I went to Ludge with my mom in 2005 to see where she's from. Although she's really from like an unknown place because she was born right when the Holocaust ended. And we were like looking for documentation of her birth, like certificates in some way, some sort of bureaucratic proof. And of course there is none, but there is proof for my grandparents and great-grandparents in the city of Ludge in Poland. And so I was, 22 or 23 when I went, and I started photographing all these news kiosks in the city. And I was interested in them because it was sort of all I had, because my mother had told me that my great-grandparents and before them that the family business were news sellers. So that's my sort of big reveal at the end of all this, was that when I imagine my family in Poland, they're selling newspapers and they're reading newspapers. So this is sort of a zoomed out kiosk with a corny It's hard to see, but in this photograph of a newspaper, which is titled News Wedge, there's the T of the New York Times sort of bending. So that's it. Thanks for hanging in there. I'm happy to converse with all of you. I know that was a little long, but you might just want to get out of here.
Thanks, Ariel. That was great. I just sent you a picture of a ceiba tree made out of newspapers, but that's not my question. I'm interested in this question of defining the news as a poet, also because I went through Naropa and I always, heard poetry as news. But also, I guess I lost the other thought. Oh yeah, and I also thought about queer gossip as news. So I just wanted to have your responses to those two notions of news beyond.
Yeah, the next lecture. I mean, the queer gossip thing is hard, right? Because I think the power of queer gossip, quote unquote, is that it's ephemeral and not recorded, perhaps. Like it's conversational. But I think it's news. It's all news. There's so much news. And I think that poetry is an amazing way to digest the news. And I think that Amy Goodman is a poet. I mean, that's how I interpret all of her sort of idiosyncratic, when I think the most poetic moments of Democracy Now! Are when she makes a mistake, right? And I've always read the correction section of the New York Times as poetry also, yeah.
I was just thinking of, hey, the difference between reading the news and being seen reading the news, and how much of reading the news is about being able to relay or re-narrate what we heard to each other, and affirm each other's kinds of beliefs and what we think is the truth. And so I'm kind of curious about that kind of space of illegibility, let's say, in seeing someone. And I think in your short narration about noticing someone's hat and them noticing your tote bag, there was something in there. And it seems like we're very much in that world of trying to create solidarity in the stupidest way by saying we read the thing that the other person read.
Totally, yeah.
Hi. Thanks for giving your talk. You made two really sharp distinctions to me in sort of the work that you went about. One being in the beginning, you made a distinction between a photojournalist and, you didn't use this word, but a street photographer, essentially, which I guess it could boil down to journalism and art. And then later towards the end of the talk, you made a distinction between a photograph and a document or documentation. And I was wondering how you yourself distinguish that content, particularly in relation to the term news. How do you draw that line?
That's an amazing observation. Also, I didn't respond, but yes. Yeah, I think that I am against calling photographers put them into genres. And was it maybe with the A.L. Steiner, the gallery show documentation that I was like, this is a documentation of the exhibition, maybe that there was a distinction. But I think that it's really interesting to think of a Helen Levitt photo who's thought to be an artist and trafficked in visual art worlds, although she was thought to be a documentary street photographer, to think of her as a journalist also. And I think it's all about where the work is shown, because you could put, I think there's a lot of art photographs that are thought to be pieces of photojournalism in the newspaper, and I'm really interested when those, the houses of where something is, or the label of something gets reversed or is removed entirely. Yeah. I probably made the distinctions in my talk subconsciously because I'm trained to put things into boxes in that way, But yeah, and I think I've made Democracy Now! My muse, but that's a really tricky thing to do, right? Because it's not intending, it's safe in a sense to talk about a photograph that's called art and analyze it and imagine about it, but then to apply the same analytical skills or descriptions or obsessiveness in reading a news show, it feels a little trickier, right? Again, because of the content, I think. Honoring the content and honoring the stories that are being told on the shows, yeah. The archive.
Yeah, I think it's a fruitful endeavor because it's not particularly the kind of, maybe the Colbert Report was the closest to somebody kind of trying to comment on her structure in a way that's humorous and artistic, but also I think he's usually saying, I'm on your side, but to look at the structure of the program with, you have such a intense passion for what she's doing, but also you can have some criticality in there as well, putting those things together. And then also just from an artist's perspective is different than what somebody who criticized, a media critic would have that I think is valuable, probably for her. Have you talked to her directly? I'm curious about that.
I've seen Amy Goodman talk on 3 occasions, but I have not met her yet. No. I did ask e-flux to invite Democracy Now! To this. Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah.
Hi. Okay, I have two unrelated questions. One is about how you feel about the disappearance of the physical newspaper, which is probably imminent-ish in terms of everything just going digital. And then the other one is, I'm reminded of a conversation I had a couple weeks ago with some people from the UK in England, and they were asking us about the election and recent events. And I remember we were trying to explain, like, no, you don't even understand. There is the news right now in the US because we can't even agree about what the basic facts are about any situation. And people just, like, is Democracy Now! The InfoWars of the left, according to the, So I wonder what you think about the differing, the sort of state we're in terms of consensus around what the news is. And maybe that does relate to the disappearance of the news as a physical object. I mean, as opposed to a digital object.
So I would argue that the news is very stable right now, and in fact, like Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! Is thriving, in a sense, and like social justice movements have become more mainstream, but they've always been sort of chipping away at covering them, and so I think that the infrastructure is there in Democracy Now! To continue doing so, but they are very limited because they're listener supported. I've had the fantasy of, like, what if, even for like a month, the staff and the funding behind the engine of the New York Times digital machine was, allocated to Democracy Now! Democracy Now! Is flawed. I think it's very rigid, and I pointed out, the way that they use shocking imagery, I think, is really problematic. In that it seems as though they're rushed and that they can't figure out a more nuanced way to tell the story. But I also think I'm really into, it's hard for me, like I get lonely and distracted when I'm looking at Instagram, but I'm really excited about like the Her Story Instagram feed and the fact that you can take a screenshot. So to answer your question of like, how do I feel about the disappearance of print newspapers? I feel sad because I like the newspaper, but I can get over it, and I'm gonna have to, in a sense. And I don't know if pining for it is, it's like I shoot film, and I process that film, and that's how I make photographs, but I also, half of my workflow is digital, right? Like, I print digitally, so it's not like I live in this like analog world, and I'm a purist in that sense. I don't know if I'm answering your question, the second one, about the InfoWars of the left, and we can't even agree. I think it's really exciting that individuals are stepping up and being like, I can do this. It's like Honey with Radio Phoenix, and when there was an alliance in Born in Flames, where it's like, I can take media and news into my own hands. And I think that's really exciting, and I wish I had more time to just read more news. Like, I'm not able to check the Democracy Now! To all these other news sources, but I wish I could, to expand it. Yeah.
I really like what you were saying about structure and timing, maybe, and like Amy Goodman is a durational artist, but also each of the Democracy Now! Broadcasts as being very sort of rigid in their structure. The only time I've ever been to a gym, I listened to Democracy Now! And I'm wondering how you feel about, and I've also never watched Democracy Now! I've only
only listened, yeah.
I've only listened to it. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the maybe formalistic aspects of Amy Goodman's project, which is 2 decades old at this point.
Yeah. Well, I think it's great that you're at the gym while listening to Democracy Now! Because I also get really angry and really anxious when listening, and it's good that you're expelling energy. But I also mostly listened, but then when I started thinking I'm gonna write about this and I'm gonna talk about it, I started watching because I was going into the archives, and it's like if you have the option for more stimulation through the visuals, you take it. Although, if you go to 1996 and listen to her early broadcasts, there's only audio. There isn't, although that photo that I had, which is maybe my favorite photo of the slideshow, of her at an initial broadcast with that mural behind her, the tarp. Yeah, I noticed the difference, and I wrote it down in my notebook many times when taking notes for this. There's so much more stimulation, and they make a lot of montages. And again, I wonder, like, what if they had more resources? I don't want to, like, say poor Democracy Now! Or, but I think that it's very stretched thin. That's it's very bare, their broadcast also. But it's also really strong and really powerful. Like, here they are, like, interviewing Lennox Hines and Angela Davis. Like, they can get Angela Davis, like, for most of their stories. Like, they can get her to come to the show, and they get a lot of it's sort of like it doesn't matter what it looks like, because they have the intellectual power, and they have really great thinkers and guests on the show. And I really admire that about them, and a range of perspectives also, which is one of Amy Goodman's critiques of corporate, network media, is that it's like professional pundits in suits and not people on the street. But again, the problem with their shocking images, even when the Dakota Access Pipeline Energy Transfer Partners hired a private security firm, and Amy Goodman kind of went viral because she had the video of dogs biting water protectors and attacking them, and they played that clip repeatedly, and it was very troubling to hear, and I couldn't listen to it, let alone look at. And I actually, in preparing this talk, I watched the video for the first time as opposed to listening it, and it was opposite to what I thought. You would intuitively think that it would be harder to look at something, but seeing the video of it was, I don't want to say easier to watch, but it was less troubling or disturbing or difficult. And I think when we're receiving information, it's all distorted and it's all out of context and it's all altered in some way. And I think when we have two options with Democracy Now! To stream it, the video, or to listen to it, that only makes that, discrepancy more apparent about how everything is being decontextualized and warped and stuff like that. God, so many questions. It's amazing.
Did you see that show about newspaper art at the New Museum in 2010?
I didn't, but I heard a yes in the audience. I haven't. I'm behind.
You might want to look into it. I mean, I can't really remember that much about it, but it might be relevant to your interest.
I'll get on it. Thank you.
Can you speak about maybe your thoughts on sort of radicalization of news and kind of the difference between a news source, a curator, and I think you definitely defined like a journalist outside of that, but maybe a news source as curation, and then you spoke a lot about presentation of the news literally versus maybe in a different context. One being art?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is that we're in a crisis right now, and have been, where, an extremely vulnerable population, trans women of color, are being murdered rapidly. And this is something actually that independent, social justice websites or groups, like the Anti-Violence Project or GLAAD, they cover, or this new website, MIC, that I found has a sort of archive memorial. But this is like headlines in Democracy Now! That bring up this epidemic and honor the people who have passed and who have been murdered. That is an example of something that does not appear in the New York Times, right? So what is happening with the New York Times where this is not appearing as news. And the role of radical journalism or radical media, right, is that people that know the people who they've lost and are mourning for them, that's happening on Instagram. And they're telling the news of what's happened from their perspective, and that's, I think, very radical. The problem is, other people having access to it, or just major news organizations not getting with the program that this needs to be headlines. And it is headlines, for example, on Democracy Now!, but it's not everywhere. And I think that we need more forms of radical journalism. I don't even know about, I can't speak necessarily to them because I'm always looking, right? It's like every day you wake up and you begin the search again for the news that's outside of yourself, out of your experiences.
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm thinking about your early showing of just and your photographs as well, just really physical aspects of newspapers and newsprint. And then you were talking about more digital forms and the screenshot, for example. I'm wondering what you think about, what are the other sort of, even if news is becoming tangible, what are the other sort of physical ways that we're interacting with the news? And what does that mean? How does it connect to the other, scrolling or whatever?
Yeah, I think, well, the very beginning of the talk, I had this sort of poetic thing where I was talking about zooming in, and now you can zoom, which is this new feature on Instagram where you used to not be able to zoom. And you would try, because you could zoom in other apps on your phone with that thing. But now you can zoom on Instagram. And also now on Instagram you can slide and have multiple images in the slideshow. And so those are two physical forms of news consumption, production that are happening. But I think it also goes back to what Rit and Rachel were saying in terms of gossip or conversation or making the space to unpack what you've digested. I always want to talk about the news every day with everyone and anyone, and I don't want to forget the news. I don't want it to be that I wake up the next day and I have this whole new thing of news to think about and remember. I want to linger on it. Yeah, and I think, that moment of recognition in seeing that someone that you don't know in the city has maybe read something that you've read, and I guess another manifestation of that would be on social media, a like. And I never did Facebook, so I'm only talking about Instagram, but.
Sorry for all the questions.
No, it's great. I'm so grateful. It's amazing.
I mean, in regards to this, and also in regards to, photographing people who are not necessarily reading the news, I have a lot of close friends, I guess, and this conversation comes up a lot because I feel like so much of being political, I guess, is involved in the Speech Act, even if it's in the social sphere or something. And even this weekend, I was with some friends, and they were I brought up I don't know, so much of the news is so natural sort of to bring up in sort of social environments, and they were saying oh, I don't read the news or something. Or one of my friends is Russian, she says she only reads Russian news. Maybe that means Sputnik. I don't really know what Sputnik is reporting on or anything. But just sort of thinking about how you reconcile with people who actually don't, or who say they don't read the news, and how and I still sort of consider them, political beings. And I think even the week of the election, there is a sort of widely circulated article that was talking about the importance of becoming a political being, whether that means reading the news or just sort of embodying this sort of idea of politics and having these sort of stances on certain issues. So I'm more curious to see where you locate politics in reading the news, and how I mean, because I don't think the news necessarily equates to politics, because there's so many different sort of aspects of the news that are politicized, whether it's the newspaper or whatever that is has its own bias or something. So I guess just locating the political within the news. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get, I guess maybe I'm wondering if you're asking if somebody doesn't read, quote unquote, the news or news in this country versus another country, does that mean that they're not doing their work as a political being? Or their homework or something?
Yeah, or even not being able to sort of like communicate with someone through like language or something about like current events or something, because this is not the way that they're exhibiting their sort of political being or something. You know?
I don't believe in creating a hierarchy over how people receive information. I think some people might have lived experiences and lives where they're experiencing the news every moment, right? They are the headline, or they are, they're in the world. And, you know, how my attraction to the news, like I said, I think is very much part of this familial inheritance and sort of behaviors that I learned. But I would love to talk to someone who doesn't, quote unquote, read the news and hear how they're thinking and being right now. And I think that a friend actually, when I told them about this talk, said, I don't read the news, and they're an extremely quote-unquote political person, right, who runs Radical Archives and documents performance art and works tirelessly doing their thing, that is their thing, to chip away at the oppressive systems of power that be right now. And I think that they were getting at that it all seems so biased, which maybe is something that you were talking about, Gordon, like where is objectivity, or where is information if everything is so distorted right now? So yes, no? No, okay. I missed it. I got some of it, right? I got some, okay. But yeah, I say like no judgment towards the person who doesn't read the news. Yeah. I mean, you asked where I stand on that, so I think that's my answer. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is about like aestheticization too, and like, or even like fetishizing the news as something that's political or aesthetic, you know, versus like it being a sort of like embodied.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to like do something with the information. Like, maybe this was something that I skipped over because I had too much material and I was sort of racing through it in the talk. But Susan Sontag warns against compassion being the sort of, when reading the news or looking at photographs of horrific things, specifically in regarding the pain of others, and how it's really important to not fall into complacency, right? So it's a lot about like not aestheticizing it, not fetishizing it. I think that you can look closely at something and also be moving into action, right? But it requires a balance and an awareness. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for asking. That was like the most robust Q&A I've ever